Across the Orthodox world, there's been a significant, we'll call it an upgrade. And one of the reasons is that everything has been upgraded. We upgraded our cars, we upgraded our simchas, we upgraded our furniture, we upgraded our vacations. Why would you not expect that our religiosity should also be upgraded?
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Sometimes it's called a move to the right. Other times it's seen as a rejection of lax religiosity. Some people think of it as an admirable commitment to serving God as best as possible. Others decry it as representing an unacceptable change from traditional Jewish practice. All these and more are reactions to the unquestionably real phenomenon of greater stringency in the Orthodox world. Determining whether this is a positive or negative development, however, is not simple. I reached out to one of my Roshei Yeshiva, Rabbi Shaya Karlinsky, in order to talk about the concept of chumrot, or stringencies, and he offered nuance where it's typically absent. He first insisted upon defining our terms and understanding the various motivating factors that lead to chumrot. Together we analyzed when this movement should be seen as a positive development, and when and how it can be dangerous or counterproductive. He talked about specific categories of stringencies, such as chumrot that lead to leniencies elsewhere, strict behavior which completely misses the larger picture, and stringencies that can be ruinous. But we also discussed many places where chumra is not only welcome, but also an essential part of developing a sense of Ahavat Hashem, love of God. We also talked about minhagim, customs, and how they fit into the larger system of Jewish law, when they are essential, and when they can potentially be problematic, and much more. It was a fascinating conversation, and frankly, it didn't go exactly as I anticipated. That, I believe, only made it more interesting and important. I'm guessing you're going to find it fascinating as well. We'll get to that conversation shortly. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Continue the discussion on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a very high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Shaya Karlinsky, born in Los Angeles, California, has been in Israel since 1968, where he studied at Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavneh and the Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem. After receiving smicha from ITRI, he completed a master's degree in educational psychology at Philadelphia's Temple University. He returned to Israel in 1975 when he began teaching in the newly developing outreach yeshivot. In 1978, he was a co-founder of Yeshiva Dar Chinom Shapels. A women's division, Midreshet Rachel V'Chaya, opened in 1983. Reflecting both his academic training and his motivational personality, Rabbi Karlinsky is dedicated to inspiring and training students to think critically and dynamically. Through the incisive way he penetrates and clarifies issues, questioning students and challenging them to question themselves, he has facilitated the Torah growth of over 4,000 men and women. Rav Shaya Karlinsky, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
An honor to be with you.
Today's conversation, Rav Karlinsky, concerns the question of whether or not there has been an increased movement towards stringency, chumra, in Orthodox society, and if so, what the positive and perhaps negative implications of that movement are. So let's open up by asking that exact question. Have we seen an increase in chumra in 21st century Orthodox Judaism?
There is no question that we have seen a significant increase. Certainly, if you compare the standards of 30 years ago, 60 years ago, I grew up in Los Angeles in the 1960s, and the standards of everything were much lower than they are today in Los Angeles. But across the Orthodox world, there's been a significant, we'll call it an upgrade. And one of the reasons is that everything has been upgraded. We upgraded our cars, we upgraded our simchas, we upgraded our furniture, we upgraded our vacations. Why would you not expect that our religiosity should also be upgraded? Okay, and that's clearly one of the motivations. Another motivation, which again is something that is a little bit more controversial, and if you want to go into the history or the sociology of it, you really need to read an article from Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. It's already 30 years old, but it still resonates, Rupture and Reconstruction, where he posits that the way Yiddishkeit and Judaism was transmitted was mnemonic. We grew up in our parents' home, the daughter grew up in the mother's kitchen and knew what to do based on what the mother did, and therefore there was a Mesorah. After World War II, there was a short circuit of that, and things became much more textual. It's interesting to note, and my father told this to me many times, the Mishnah Berurah before World War II was not viewed as an authoritative halachic source. It was there, but it wasn't viewed the way it is today. And according to Chaim Soloveitchik, it was because once we lost the mnemonic tradition, we've got to go rely on the books. And another thing is that my father's opinion is that the focus or the locus of authority shifted from local rabbanim to Rosh Yeshivas. And that also had an impact on how the younger generation was relating to halacha. But whatever it's definitely has happened, we can talk about the pros and the cons, but there's no question it's happened.
That's really interesting, everything that you just said, Rav Karlinsky. I want to ask you about that because in talking about religious upgrade, to use your term, that can be understood in two different ways. One way would be that perhaps before we weren't being careful enough, and now we're being more careful. The other way is before we were doing it perfectly fine, but now we want to do more. Whether that's positive or negative is a different question altogether. But in one case, we're now reaching the standards that always should have been the standards. And the other way of looking at it, we're going beyond the standards to try to do more than the halacha requires. Which are you referring to, or are you referring to both?
The answer to your question is yes. They're both true, okay? There's no question that the standards were much more minimum standards, and there is in halacha the idea of minimum standards, and then there's basic halacha. We could really divide it into, and there's a big mistake, which we will talk about. There is such a thing as basic halacha, the accepted halacha. Then there are dissenting opinions, which are lenient. Those are kulas, those are mekel. And Rabbanim always used to say that under certain circumstances, we rely on the mekel, and that's why those opinions were brought. And then there is the machmir, the more stringent opinion. And here there's a lot of confusion. What does it mean to be machmir? Because in the halachic texts, machmir usually means there's a machlokus in the halacha, and there are opinions that are more stringent and opinions that are more lenient. And machmir means we're going to follow the more stringent opinion. And that's brought already in the Gemara. And there are many examples where that's viewed positively and many examples where that's viewed negatively.
You see, what I think is so fascinating is when you mention the name of your father, that the Mishnah Berurah has become standard, whereas it was not before. I heard something very similar from Rav Shechter, who said when he was growing up, not that it was just the oral tradition, but people looked in the Chayei Adam. That's how he described it. And the Mishnah Berurah is famous for being somewhat machmir, meaning even though it's become standard, compared to, for example, other halacha sfarim that are contemporaneous, like the Aruch HaShulchan is known for being relatively lenient, relatively speaking. Every once in a while, he will throw in a whopper of a chumrah, but broadly speaking, he's generally more lenient, whereas broadly speaking, the Mishnah Berurah is stricter. And that sounds like the move towards the Mishnah Berurah as opposed to the other halacha sfarim, meaning the fact that we've almost codified the Mishnah Berurah or established it as the source par excellence to which to go, indicates that the chumrah is not only talking about reaching the levels that are required, but the second level, going beyond what was normally considered halacha in the past. Would you agree with that?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, again, we need to make sure we're understanding the word chumrah correctly. When we say that the Aruch HaShulchan takes more lenient and the Mishnah Berurah takes more stringent, we're talking when there are machlokuses in halacha. There's another aspect of chumrah which has come up, and that is the idea when in doubt, do without. In other words, that we're not sure what to do, so let's just be machmir, cover all our bases. I believe that that's also alluded to by Dr. Soloveitchik, the idea that he coins a fascinating phrase, maximum compliance syndrome. I want to be able to check all the boxes. I covered all my bases. And we can view that a little bit negatively when we realize what's motivating us. What is the motivation for being more strict, more stringent? Is the motivation self-centered? well, I want to make sure I get in a better place in Olam Haba? Or is it motivated by the desire to serve God better because I have the ability? There's a fascinating line in the Maral's introduction to Pirkei Avos in Derech Chaim on the Mishnah, the very first Mishnah, Hevi metunim badin, hamidu talmidim harbe, the asu siag la Torah. Now, when we hear the words siag la Torah, the first thing that comes to mind is that's part of the avoda me'ahava or avoda me'yira.
Just to define our term, siag la Torah means making a fence around the Torah. And the question is this an aspect of fear or love of God?
Fear or love of God, okay? And everybody will say, your instinct tells you it's avoda me'yira, because a siag is I want to make sure I don't do it wrong. So therefore we build a fence to make sure that we don't trip over the wrong. So the Maral strikingly says, he analyzes that Mishnah and says that Mishnah is giving us three lessons. One is built on the fear, gevura, din. You know, we have three midos. We have din, we have chesed, and we have tiferet, Yaakov. Avraham is chesed, Yitzchak is din, and Yaakov is tiferet. And the Maral says that heavy metunim badin, that's midas hadin, that's gevura. And hamidu talmidim harbe, that's Torah. And asu siag la Torah, that's chesed and ahava, because we want to make sure, because we love the Almighty, we want to do more than is necessary. In a spousal relationship, you don't want to just check the boxes. You want to do for your spouse because you love your spouse and you want to do more than is demanded. Says the Maral, that's what asu siag la Torah is supposed to mean. So our chumra really is supposed to be motivated by the desire to upgrade and do more in our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not so that I can earn more reward in Olam Haba. That's a very fine motivation, okay? But at the end of the day, that's more self-centered. That's what we call almanat lekabel pras. We're doing it with the intent of reward. And the ideal service, and the Rambam talks about this, and the Maral talks about this, is that our ideal service is to serve God out of love. And that has to be the motivation. And therefore, when we want to do better and more, that has to be the motivation, as opposed to being worried, oh, I might get nailed if I don't eat the right hechsher.
You know, last night it happened to be that I was learning Mesilat Yesharim with my son Netanel, and we came up in the fourth chapter when it's describing Zihirut, being watchful and being careful, this exact idea, although more on the side of Yira, more on the side of fear. I'm going to just quote what he says over there, that the people who are Shlemei Hadat, the people who have the highest level of consciousness, I would call it, people who understand what's going on, they want to make sure that because they realize that mitzvot are the means through which they get close to God, they never want to lose any of them. And because of that, it will say, Al Kain, Lo Yivcharu Ella Harbot Bahem, they will therefore choose only to increase their mitzvah observance, and to be stringent in all of their details. And this is a very positive thing in the Ramchal's understanding over here. It's the same concept, although unlike the Maharal, he's looking at it more from the sense of fear of losing out on your ultimate goal in life.
Okay, all right. And so one of the problems when we talk about chumra is the requirement to really know halacha. The Shach at the very end of his treatise on Psak Halacha writes that a person has to make sure that they're not machmir more than is necessary, because that can be very destructive. And then you, of course, get to the idea of a chumra de'asi lidei kula. And this is probably one of the most dangerous things. Chumra de'asi lidei kula means that by being stringent in one area, it could lead to a leniency or a violation in another area. Okay, maybe we'll take a few concrete examples because it's very instructive. The issue of offering food or drink to a workman who's not religious, and you know he's not going to make a bracha. So there's an aspect there of lifnei iver, of putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person. If you don't give it to him, then he won't eat without a bracha. If you give it to him, he's going to eat without a bracha. So it's already brought down in the early poskim. It's already brought down in the Ramah and in the Taz, and the Chazon Ish talks about it in Hilchos Shvius, and Rosh Shlomo Zalman used to paskin it Lamaisa. You have a worker in the house, he's not religious, and you don't give him a drink because he's not going to make a bracha. That is going to lead to a hatred of Jews and a hatred of Torah, and therefore you give it to him and you don't worry about it. That's a chumra de'asi lidei kula. That's one example. Two more examples. Rav Gusman, I heard from somebody who was close to Rav Gusman. We have other things to say from Rav Gusman. There was a bacher who he threw out of the yeshiva because the bacher was meisering the vegetables on his plate, the food that the yeshiva served. And there were two problems. A, that means you're not relying on the yeshiva's kashrus. But more important, that is baltashkis. It's baltashkis. You're wasting food. So that's an isser d'oraisa. I'll show you a very delicate question and why we have to know the halacha. I heard this question raised. I think it went to Rav Zilberstein. Somebody who is machmir, and it's a chumra on pas Yisrael. We only eat pas Yisrael and not pas aku. How do we only eat bread that it was baked by Sabbath observant Jews and not by non-Jews, even though they're both kosher? Obviously, if the ingredients aren't kosher, there's nothing to talk about. So there is a chumra to only eat bread baked by Sabbath observant Jews. And you see that it's a chumrah because the Mishnah Berurah brings that explicitly when he lists the idea of Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of repentance, where we want to upgrade our service of God and take on stringencies that we normally don't do all year. He says it's a very good idea during the 10 days of repentance to not eat bread baked by a non-Jew. So it's a chumrah. So the story is, the shaila was, that there is a Jew from Israel, and in Israel he keeps Pat Yisrael. It's very easy in Israel to only eat bread baked by Sabbath observant Jews. Now he goes to Chutz La'aretz, and he had to be there for a significant amount of time because of a medical question, and he was in a place where it was not possible to get bread baked by Shomer Shabbos Jews, so he had to rely on the leniency or compromise on the chumrah of Pat Yisrael. And now he comes back to Israel, and he's left with a few pieces of bread. What's the problem? Well, in Israel, he keeps the chumrah. But if he doesn't eat them, it's going to be baltashkis. Okay, now, just to show how complicated that question is because there's a machloket whether baltashkis only means to actively destroy food, in which case he had no problem, he could just let it go stale, or no, you're over baltashkit even if you passively let food get ruined. So these are, you see here that it's not a risk-free game to say I'm going to be machmir, because sometimes I want just one more very fascinating story that I heard from my son, who heard it from the grandson. It was the grandson of Aaron Leib Steinman. So my son heard from the grandson that was involved in the story. So Reb Leib Steinman he meistered everything that came into the house. He didn't rely. He was meister. So there's always little pieces. You meister a cucumber. There's a half a cucumber left. He meistered half it right, but there's half a cucumber left. You meister a banana, there's a half a banana left. So the Rebbetzin was very uncomfortable with the fact that little pieces of vegetables and fruits are getting laid around. Okay, Seder, so no problem. He made sure not to leave it over. Now, he also had a chumrah on bananas. He never ate bananas because there was a shaila on banana, whether it's a ha'etz or adama. So he took out a chumrah not to eat bananas. So one time he's in the house with a grandson, a little grandson, and there's a banana, and he meisters the banana, and now there's three quarters of a banana left. So he doesn't want to leave it over because the Rebbetzin is going to get upset. So he asks the grandson, come on over and eat the banana. And the grandson says, Saba lo mitchashekli. I don't want a banana. And he tried it. The grandson's not going to eat the banana. So Reb Leib Steinman ate the banana because he understood that he has a chumrah. But if he keeps that chumrah, it's going to lead to a tremendous leniency in his relationship with his wife. He's going to upset his wife.
Very interesting.
So we have to be very sensitive to these things. Okay, there's more to talk about in this area, but let me see what else you would like me to address.
Okay, there's a lot to say even in that particular question. For example, which we shouldn't talk about right now because it's probably taking us too far afield, how one determines which side wins in that case in the chumrah dati de kula.
No, that's not far afield at all. That's foundational to the whole discussion. Okay? And that is built on lo am haaretz chasid, lo bur yirei chet. We need knowledge. And here's the opportunity for me to share a very important section in Rav Wolbe about the idea of making these kinds of decisions. So Rav Wolbe quotes two Gemaras, one in the Bavli, one in the Yerushalmi. The theme is the same. In the Bavli, it talks about a man who's walking by a river and he sees a woman drowning. And he says, it's not proper to look at women. And the woman drowns. And the Yerushalmi, he's walking by a river and there's a child drowning in the river. And he says, oi, okay, I got to save him, but I first got to take off my tefillin because you're not supposed to go into the water with tefillin on. And of course, you know what happened. It says the Gemara calls that chassid shote. Chassid shote. What is a chassid shote? Chassid means he's very pious. He's going beyond. He wants to get close to God, and he wants to do it the best way possible. But he's doing it without, what Rav Wolbe says, he's a shote. He's doing it without dot. He's not thinking. There's no logic. And there's where the balance comes in. And there's where you have to think and you have to know what are the priorities. And in halacha, what we alluded to, you've got to know what are the priorities. And the Gemara has many examples of Tanoim and Amoraim that were strict. But where were they strict? In Ben Adam Lechavero. Okay, that the stories about returning lost objects and paying for damages, that's where they were strict. And there's another story where, again, there's a chumra that they had about not walking in a certain way. And it says that if he was alone, he always avoided the situation. But when he was walking with other people, he didn't conform to the chumra because it would make other people feel bad. So here we get into the idea again of what are the consequences of the chumra. Now, again, we're not talking here about violating halacha. We're talking here about demanding a higher level of always following the strict opinion as opposed to the more lenient opinion. That's the balance.
You know, when I ran a yeshiva with Pesach Weliki, people would go back for Pesach or for the summer, and sometimes students would talk about what they're going to do that's going to be more frum, what's going to be more strict. And I used to say to them, you should be really strict in Kibbud Av V'Em. I'd always tell them, before you leave, go and learn Hilchot Kibbud Av V'Em and Derei Deah, because so many parents are worried their kids are going to come back, they're going to be more religious than they are, and they're not going to respect them anymore. I know this is a common fear. I'd say, you know what? The most important chumrah that I think you can take on is showing your parents that you're more respectful of them now, and that your increased devotion to Torah has led to an increased respect for your parents. I want to ask you also, Rav Karlinsky, though, about a different kind of chumrah, which seems to be counteracted by the Gemara when it says, koach dehetera adif. It's better to be lenient on some level. It describes that in certain places. The power of leniency is stronger or preferable. I want to know how you understand that line compared to the idea of this, what we've seen before in the Maharal and the Ramchal and the other places where we say that it's good to be strict.
Well, you just learned wrong. I no offense, but anybody who interprets those words in the way you did is learning wrong pshat. That's not the pshat. Pshat koach dehetera adif doesn't mean it's always better to be mekel. Rashi says there explicitly on the spot more than once. Koach dehetera adif means that when you have an Amora or a Tana or a rabbi who paskened l'chumra and another one who paskened l'kula. Now we're talking here about authoritative people. So it's more important to inform and rely on the mekil when he's authoritative, because the chumra doesn't tell you for sure that he examined the issue in depth and reached the conclusion that it's usur, because it could be he wasn't sure, and there is a concept. When you're not sure, you have to be machmir. So koach dehetera adif means that when I want to inform the opinion and you inform me about the heter, that's more reliable when you're informed. It doesn't mean that when you have a choice, always choose the heter. That's absolutely not correct pshat. Rashi says it means that the person who authoritatively reached a conclusion of heter, you know for sure he examined the issue. Okay, where, again, we're talking authoritative people, not people who don't take it seriously. Okay, whereas the person who said it's usur, we're not sure whether he examined it carefully or he wasn't sure, and therefore he was required to say usur.
On the other hand, I think, from my experience, there are cases where chumrah can be a dangerous thing, where chumrah can sometimes go over the top and be dangerous, even if it's not necessarily a chumrah da'ati lidei kula, even if it's not a stringency that's going to lead to a leniency elsewhere. It can lead to, if I want to put it in extreme terms, and I don't want to psychoanalyze it, obsessive compulsive behavior, or various other types of behaviors which are not necessarily healthy. Would you agree that there are some times when chumrah can be a negative?
Absolutely. There's a section in Rav Dessler, it's a very small section in Chelek Gimel, where he talks about stringencies and leniencies. And he says that the kochot hanefesh, the personality, is a very delicate instrument. And too often, if I go out of balance in one area, it's compensated in another area. Okay, and we see it all the time. We see that a person could be very generous in his tzedakah in order to rationalize his cutting corners in his business dealings. That the Yetzer Hara, Rav Wolbe talks about, Rav Dessler talks about this in just a few lines. Okay, is that if you're going to be machmir, realize that chumras are not risk free. That sometimes you're machmir as a tool that the Yetzer Hara uses against you, so that you will be more lenient in other areas. All right, there are so many examples. I mean, Rav Dessler talks about the the case in Slobodka, where there was a guy who used to get dressed up for Shabbos and come into the Beis Medrash 4 or 5 hours before Shabbos. He was Makabel Shabbos very early, okay? And the Alter from Slobodka was very upset at him. The language he used is, if you do that, you're really, subconsciously, you're looking at us as Mechalei Shabbos. I'm better than you. We're better than you. And that's a very dangerous thing. And again, it's a very common tool of the Yetzer Hara to get us to be machmir in one area as a justification, as a rationalization, as assuaging our guilt feelings of being lenient in another area. And therefore, our chumras have to be aligned. Why do you think, and you have to ask again, why do we want to be machmir? What's the goal of the chumrah? Because we want to serve God in the best way possible. So why do you think that having a triple glot kosher hedonistic experience is serving God better? The Ramban writes, Kedoshim to you, don't be a glot kosher hedonist. And we want to be very machmir in our kashrus, but somehow or other, we're very makil in Kedoshim Tihiyu. And we have to realize that we have to know we're doing it to serve God better. And we have to make sure that the motivation and the behavior and the practice is in balance. Again, the guy who cheats in business and justifies it by giving a lot of tzedakah, that's the trick of the Yetzer Hara.
You know, I don't want to go back and rehash the entire story again. People can listen to it in my recent episode with Rav Yitzchak Shurin. But there I told a story about someone who wanted to buy our house about 20 years ago. And without getting into all the details, essentially they asked a Rav if they were allowed to move to our street because it wasn't a frum enough street. That was one thing which they did ask. What they didn't ask, and they asked us to do, was to predate the contract in order to avoid certain penalties because they're Olim Chadashim who are about to lose their Aliyah rights. So apart from the fact they're defrauding the government, they're also violating the concept of Shar Mukdam, which means you can't have a contract which is predated. You can only have it post-dated or on the correct date. They thought to ask about, am I allowed to move to the street? It may not be frum enough in a Ramat Beit Shemesh. But to ask about an actual Choshen Mishpat din, they didn't even think of asking that. So that's an example of what you're talking about, I believe.
This is a standard problem of the inequality of the mismatch in the things that we want to be machmir on and the things that we are much more lenient on. And again, in the Gemara, it's pointed, if you look carefully in the Gemara, whenever it talks about chumras, it always talks about lifni mishuras HaDin in ben adam lechavero. Now, there is another concept that we didn't touch on and we need to touch on, okay? And that is a chumra that leads to arrogance, yuara. The Gemara is very careful about instructing us to avoid a chumrah that leads to arrogance. The classic example, famous Mishnah in Sukkah, okay, where it says that ochlin arai chutz l'sukkah. You're allowed to have a snack outside of the sukkah. And then the next Mishnah says that they brought some snacks to two Tanayim, and they said helum l'sukkah. So the Gemara right away there asks, wait a minute, you brought a story that contradicts the thesis. The thesis was you're allowed to eat a snack, and you told me a story where they made you eat it in the sukkah. Says the Gemara, well, there's something missing. The chiddush of the story is that if you want to be machmir and bring it into the sukkah when you're not required, let le mishum yuhara. That's not called arrogance, which means that there are things that you're not supposed to do. It's brought down in the poskim nowadays. I don't know exactly. It's not in the Hasidic literature, but there were shilas. Are you allowed to wear your tzitzis over your shirt? Well, only the biggest tzaddikim wore their tzitzis over the shirt, and therefore the question is that are you representing yourself as being on a higher madrega than you really are? And he's clear in the Gemara that that's inappropriate. So what that leads to is, and this is also brought in the Gemara, I alluded to it a minute ago, is that you want to do a chumrah, do it in private. All right, too often we wear our chumras on our sleeve. We let everybody know that we're machmir. Okay, and that's right away. That's usually built on yura. That's not built on the motivation to serve God. That's built on arrogance. That's built on ego. And we have to be very careful that that's not what happens. You want to be machmir, do it in private. And in fact, you see many examples in the Gemara where you're allowed to do it in private, but you're not supposed to do it in public. And there was a chiddush of Helum Lasukkah. It was a chiddush that they're able to be machmir and bring the food into the sukkah. And again, that has to do with the whole concept of sukkah. You have to know, but you have to understand the sugya. And we always get asked, well, how? You have to know by knowing the sugya or speaking to somebody who knows the sugya. And that's at the end of the day what Rav Wolbe was talking about when he said you have to do it with dot. You can't just be frum. You have to do it with dot. Otherwise, you could end up being a chassid shot. You could do something because you want to get close to God and be stupid by doing the opposite of what you're really supposed to do.
I want to ask about that idea of doing it in private, though, because there are times that even if someone is doing something in private, that can lead in some ways to great arrogance as well. Because even if you're not doing it to show off in front of other people, you are doing it potentially to make yourself feel that you are frummer in a way which is arrogant, which leads me to the example of Yuhara given in the second parak of Brachot, when Rabban Gamliel says that one does not say Kriyat Shema the night that one gets married, and yet he did. When his students asked him, why are you saying Kriyat Shema? You said that one is patur, exempt from Kriyat Shema this night. He said, I can't listen to that idea. To not say Kriyat Shema one night is unthinkable for me. His son, nonetheless, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, points out that not everyone is allowed to do that. You have to be on the level to do that because it's Yuhara. So we see here also something which obviously by definition is private, at the same time may be Yuhara nonetheless, and may be arrogant nonetheless.
I wouldn't use the word arrogance. I would use the word pretending that you are what you're not. That's the lesson of that Gemara. You're pretending to be something that you're really not. Okay, that I think is what's going on there.
That's very reasonable. I want to make sure we don't forget to say the story of Rav Yisrael Salanter that you told me you wanted to tell.
One Yom Kippur, Rav Yisrael Salanter doesn't show up for Kol Nidre. And they're waiting, and they're waiting. There's two versions of the story, whether he never came or whether they finally found him, they sent people looking for him. Either way, the reason he didn't show up was because he's sitting there rocking a baby. What happened? The mother left the baby sleeping because she wants Kol Nidre. She wants Kol Nidre. And the baby wakes up crying. And Rabbi Shlomo Salanter was sending a message. Your job is to take care of the baby, not to go to Kol Nidre. Again, that's the question of knowing priorities, that we have to have the correct priorities.
I wonder if what you're saying right now relates to this desire to quote unquote be frum. I want to quote something that you wrote in an article. This is what you said. Rav Wolbe writes that frumkeit, which is a Yiddish word implying a high level of religiosity, is an instinctive drive to relate to the Almighty Creator. It is found even among animals. While this instinct makes the very difficult job of serving God somewhat easier for us, as an instinctual drive, it is rooted in egocentrism, as are all instincts. So, Rav Karlinsky, can you elaborate on that point and explain why that's problematic?
What is my motivation? What is my motivation? In other words, again, we come back to the concept of ava and yira, love and fear. Fear means I'm worried about myself. All right? And I do things. You can have that in a spousal relationship. Okay, I don't want to forget my spouse's birthday because I know that I'm going to have to sleep on the couch and have cold dinner. Okay, so therefore I'm going to make sure I don't forget my spouse's birthday. Or I could say, you know what, if I forget my spouse's birthday, I lost an opportunity to make her feel good. So one is ava and one is yira. So what is motivating me? Is motivating me, I'm worried about myself. That's instinct. Instinct is always self-preservation. So we have a high level of self-preservation. We understand that the goal, my egocentric goal, is not more money, right? Or not hedonistic pleasure, but it's the next world. That's a very high level goal, but it's all about me. It's not about serving God. The Maharal talks about service has to be altruistic. It has to be for the purpose and the goal of serving one who you're serving. And the example that we give is when you go into a restaurant and the waiter gives you good service, the waitress gives you good service. That is not, says the Maharal, shelo al manat lakabel pras. That's not the essence of service. They're giving you good service because they want to get a good tip. Says the Maharal, that's okay, because the waiter or waitress was not created to serve you, and therefore it's legitimate for them to do it for reward. But we're created to serve God. And therefore the service we have to give has to be the essence of service. And the essence of service is to serve, not so that I will get something back. Right? And that's what Rav Wolbe is talking about, egocentrism. Instinct is always egocentric. And therefore, many times I serve God because I'm looking for the payoff. Now, we have a high concept of payoff. And in the secular world, the payoff is lots of money or some pleasure. And us, the payoff is the next world. That's great. I mean, halavai, we should all realize that. But at the end of the day, that's egocentric.
I'd like to move on to what I think is a related topic, which is the concept of minhagim, or customs, in today's world. It seems to me that the entire source of people's customs, or minhagim, has changed drastically from the way it was 100 or 150 years ago, and certainly before that. Once upon a time, your minhag was that which you did in your local shtetl, your local community. Now, all of those communities that were the main Jewish communities of 150 years ago, Jews don't live there anymore. It's completely moved either to Israel or to places like the United States. And those old shtetls, or the communities in the Arab world where Jews once lived, they're gone. That has practically meant that nowadays people either don't have their old minhagim, they don't keep them, or alternatively, they just take on whatever they want, which means that the whole idea of minhag has gone over a major revision. And that has led to, I think, some questionable practices at times. Rav Yaakov Hillel talks about, he wrote a book about, Tamim Tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha, you're supposed to be completely whole and perfect and trusting in Hashem. And sometimes some of the minhagim we have, and I use the word minhagim in a general sense, actually tend to violate that. And these are, in a certain sense, chumrot, not in the sense that you were saying before, but extra practices that people take on. And not only are they perhaps unnecessary, sometimes they can actually violate the Torah itself. Do you see this happening at all, or this something which I see which you don't agree with?
So again, I think that the first thing we have to do is we have to clarify our concepts, and we're using words in places that are not appropriate. Okay? When you talk about a minhag, you're already out of the world of chumra. We decided chumra means that I am following a more strict opinion in halacha when there's a dispute in halacha. Okay, now there's a different system called minhag. And you see in the Gemara, Minhag Yisrael HaDin, that if there is a minhag that got entrenched in the Jewish people, sometimes we even consider it more severe, more serious, more meticulously observed than a din, if that's a minhag that is entrenched. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now again, so you would have to elaborate on what you mean by minhagim as opposed to just the way people behave.
Can you explain what you mean? What is the difference there?
The fact that people behave in a certain way, that doesn't make it a minhag. That doesn't make it a minhag. Okay, it means that it could be that superstition, it could be a segula, it could be a distorted vision of how we're supposed to run our lives, but don't call that minhag. Minhag means that we're something entrenched. Kitniot on Pesach in the Ashkenazic world is a minhag, but it's a minhag that took root, and therefore you treat it very seriously. Gebroxt in the Hasidic community took root. The reasons aren't applicable anymore, but the fact that the minhag took root makes it something that we've got to be very careful about ignoring or being lax in. But don't call it a chumrah. It's a minhag, and there are minhagim. Now, just to show you how, and here we can get to the idea of public and private. If you talk about minhag, we have to access the issue of 2 days yontif. 2 days yontif. Now, the Gemara says clearly that the reason why we keep 2 days yontif, even though we have a fixed calendar, the language is minhag avosenu biyadein. So right away you understand you're in the world of minhag, but it's a minhag that's legislated and entrenched, and therefore it's got to be followed. However, the Gemara in Psachim, and this is the practical application of whether you're supposed to keep 1 day yontif or 2 days yontif if you are in Chutz La'aretz, a ben Chutz La'aretz in Israel or ben Israel in Chutz La'aretz. The Gemara there talks about people who go from city A that has a minhag that is strict to people who go to city B that has a minhag in that same behavior that's lenient. So here we can use the word chumra, but it doesn't mean chumra. It means there are some people who refrain from a certain activity on Erev Pesach in the morning. And in other cities, the minhag is not to refrain. The halacha is that you have to refrain after chatzot, after midday. But in the morning, there were two different opinions, and different communities had different customs. And then the Gemara says, okay, so what happens if somebody goes from community A that follows the minhag of refraining from melacha, and he goes to a city with intention to return, he's only there temporarily, and he goes to a city where the minhag is to do melacha, or the reverse. He's in a city where the minhag that he has is to do melacha, and he goes to a city where you don't do melacha. So the Gemara says the first thing is you have to follow the stringencies of both opinions, meaning if you're planning on going back, you have to follow the stringencies. Talk about maximum compliance syndrome. Okay, you have to do the stringency of the place that you left and the stringency of the place that you come to. So in our example, it would mean that if you come from a place that doesn't do malacha, doesn't do work in the morning, that's a stringency compared to the one who does do work. So if I go to the place that does do work, I'm not allowed to do work. Okay, and if I go from the place that does work to the place that doesn't do work, the chumrah is not to do work. But there's one caveat. The Gemara says, Al Yishana Mipnei HaMachloket. You are not allowed to deviate from the local custom minhag if it's going to create machloket. And then the Gemara has a problem. So that means that the person who has a minhag not to do malacha, not to do work on Erev Pesach in the morning, and he's going to a place that does malacha, so he's not allowed to deviate from the local minhag because it will create machloket, and therefore he has to do malacha. But what happened to the idea that he's got to observe the stringencies, which is not doing malacha? And the Gemara's only solution is that not doing malacha is not a deviation that creates machloket, because a person says he's just a batlan. He's a lazy bum.
Doesn't have a job.
Okay. So there are poskim that say that if he's well known, this is basically on the Yerushalmi, the language in the Yerushalmi, that if it's well known that this guy never misses a day, he's a workaholic, okay, and he is a 624 guy, and the only time he doesn't do malach is on Shabbos and on Yom Tov and Erev Pesach in the afternoon, okay, but he doesn't do it in the morning because the minhag of his city is not to do it, and he goes to a place where the minhag is to do malacha, and he's going to sit there not doing malacha. Everybody's going to know he's doing it as a deviation from the local minhag, and they're opposing to say he has to do malach. But that's only in minhag, okay? But we can now decide if you're only doing something because of a chumrah. Here, you want another classic example of a chumrah d'aseh kula. Apparently, it's a real story, and Rav Shlomo Zalman went ballistic over it when he saw it. You know, there are people who don't like to carry the eruv; they don't rely on the eruv. They don't carry on Shabbos. There's a guy who doesn't carry on Shabbos, but he needs to get a bench from the shul to the house. So his father is carrying the bench on Shabbos for him. Okay, that's a perfect example of a chumrah d'aseh kula. Now, if there's no eruv, nobody's allowed to carry. But if you have a chumrah not to rely on the eruv because there's a machlokas, and there is a machlokas about whether the eruv is good and not good, etc., you've got to be careful that you're not having your father carry the bench because you don't rely on the eruv.
The question of taking on the chumros of both place, and in particular when it comes to Yom Tov Sheni, al yishanim ibnei machloket, don't change things or don't act differently because of the possibility of arguments, that can lead to all sorts of consequences that a lot of people don't even think about.
The al yishanim ibnei machlokes would lead to the refraining of making public second-day minyanim in Israel for bnei chutz la'aretz. 75 years ago, they were very frowned upon. Rav Shlomo Zalman held 75 years ago that you shouldn't do it because it's a violation of al yishanim ibnei machlokes. What changed? What changed is that so many tourists come and everybody knows that there are bnei chutz la'aretz and they keep 2 days, and therefore walking around in Shabbos clothes on Yisru Chag, everybody understands you're a ben chutz la'aretz, and therefore it's not called al yishanim ibnei machlokes. But it's an issue. It's an issue that you have to realize that when you publicly flaunt a minhag, then you may be creating machlokas.
But what I found interesting is that even though in general I see a lot of chumrah inflation when it comes to minhagim also doing more and more things, one area where I think that is not the case, and I think that there's a very noticeable distinction, at least in my experience, between the Israeli Haredi community and the modern Orthodox or Dati Leumi communities, is that when people come from chutz la'aretz in the non-Haredi world, I've seen it become extremely common. They by and large seem to keep only 1 day of Yom Tov, even though it seems to me that it's much easier to justify halachically, from the laws of minhag, keeping 2 days of Yom Tov. On the other hand, from what I see, people in the Haredi world are less likely to keep 1 day and are more likely to keep 2 days of Yom Tov, which again is the more easily understandable rule when it comes to minhag. Now, that almost goes against everything I just said about the chumrah inflation. In this case, we have a situation where at least some people are taking what seems like the easy way out.
That you're pinpointing a problem because they're looking for convenience. I hate to say it, they're looking for convenience. Now, again, there are halachic justifications for keeping 1 day Yom Tov, but you've got to go in to the halachic justifications of it and know that this is a very serious halachic sugya, and there is a big machlokas already 150 years ago as people started coming from chutz la'aretz to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, there's a psak of the Chacham Tzvi and Rav Kook, but the mainstream opinion was that you do keep 2 days, but the inverse of that is that an Israeli who goes to chutz la'aretz has to keep 2 days in anything that's related to public actions. Okay, and again, I do remember that there were Israelis who were very lenient about that, and they used to drive up to shul on Simchas Torah. Inappropriate. But again, it's because we don't really know how the system works. The bottom line is, when you make these kinds of decisions, you got to know how the system works.
So that means that when it comes to both chumrot and understanding minhagim, a lot of it is a matter of not being ignorant, of avoiding ignorance.
That's all it's about. That's all it's about. There's another aspect, very important, and the Shach in the end of his treatise on Psach. If you say that something that's mutter is asur, you're misrepresenting the Torah. That's the first problem. And misrepresenting the Torah is a compromise on Torah being emes. And therefore it says in the Yerushalmi, you're not allowed to say about something that's tahor that it's tameh, and you're not allowed to say about something that's tameh that it's tahor. Obviously, if it's tameh and I say tahor, it's going to lead to a terrible violation. But it also says that if it's tahor and I say it's tameh, that's also asur. To say that something that is permissible is prohibited, it's wrong. And this is the confusion. And we see this in our institutions because we deal mostly with Baalei Tshuva, but unfortunately it's something that's spread outside of the Baal Tshuva world. And that is the confusion between Ikar HaDin, Chumra, and Minhag. They're not all the same. But if you're taught that they're all the same, no, this is Din, even though it's only Minhag. This is Din, even though it's only Chumra. It's a misrepresentation. It's a misrepresentation. Okay, I mean, again, we have it in the problem of kashrus, and we have it in the problem of all kinds of behaviors, that there's a gross confusion about what is the Ikar HaDin, what is a chumra, meaning a chumra, again, the way it's supposed to be defined is following a more strict opinion when there's a dispute.
I want to ask you another question about minhagim before we move off of that particular topic, because I want to ask once again about this concept of minhagim, and again, maybe the word is not the right word in this particular case, but a minhag that violates, at least potentially violates, something that appears in Chazal or maybe even in the Torah. For example, people say they have a minhag, and you might say that's the wrong term, of shlisel challah. I'm throwing this out. This is the practice of making a challah in the shape of a key, or alternatively putting a key into your challah the Shabbos immediately after Pesach. And it's supposed to help you with your parnasah, your sustenance, or alternatively be a symbol of sustenance, whatever. And to me, this is problematic because Chazal say that either a person is judged for sustenance every day, or he's judged on Rosh Hashanah, or perhaps if you understand it a certain way, the Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah talks about 4 times a year that a person is judged or people are judged. Regardless, none of those times are the Shabbos after Pesach. So if a person is doing this in order to get better sustenance, to get a better job, to get more money, number one, I don't think theologically it makes any sense. I don't think God works that way, that because I made a challah in the shape of a key, somehow that's like magic, that God will do something like that. That's not called having a relationship with God. That's called trying to force God's hand. So I think it's ridiculous. But apart from that, this implies that this is a specific day that's good for parnasah, and Chazal never say that. Do you agree with my assessment?
No.
Okay.
You're pinpointing the wrong problem. Okay, you're pinpointing the wrong problem. The problem that you raised about a person's parnasa being dictated on Rosh Hashanah Kippur, that's not a contradiction to it, because we do lots of things during the year that are said to enhance our parnasa. The fact that we daven every day, right? Barech Aleinu Shoshana Azos. Well, I understand. What are we davening for? God already decided.
Right, but I'm saying it's either every day or a Shana. Those are the two possibilities.
No. Again, you're pinpointing the wrong problem. The problem is whether there is a source for it. We need sources. These kinds of things. When you have a minhag, you say, "Oh, this is a minhag." You have to have a source. You know, there's a famous joke. I'm not sure whether it's a true story or just a joke, but it's certainly illustrative, of the young lady who's getting married, and she wants to follow all of her mother's minhagim, and she's going through all the minhagim. And one of the minhagim was that on Erev Shabbos, before you put the chicken into cook, you cut off a little piece and then you put it into cook. Where did that minhag come from? And the mother says, "I don't really know, but that's what my mother did. So let's go ask Safta, let's ask Bubby where it came from. Let's see where the minhag comes from." So they go to ask her and she says, "What are you talking about? My pot was too small, so I had to cut off a piece of the chicken would fit." Okay, so that could be a true story. Okay, and as you've got to know, where do we sometimes make up minhagim. You want a Baal Tshuva joke? I'll give you a Baal Tshuva joke. Okay, the guest goes to the hostess after Kiddush Friday night and asks to borrow rings because she forgot her rings and she needs rings for Netilas Yadayim. You see things and you don't know where it comes from. Okay, And all of a sudden we start making up minhagim. So you have to know a minhag, the shlisel chala. My only question is, what's your source? If you have a source, wonderful. You don't have a source, then where's it coming from?
That makes sense. I'll say a related story that I heard from the Rav of my shul, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. He said that on a certain Shabbos Chazon, the Shabbos during the 9 days, a particular person said to his wife, we need to have fleishiks at Shalashudas. That's my family minhag. And she wasn't having fleishiks, and he was very upset. He said, how can we not have fleishiks on the Shabbos of the 9 days at Shalashudas? My mother always had fleishiks then. And his wife had never heard of this minhag, so they went to ask the rabbi. They asked the rabbi, is that a real minhag? And he said, absolutely not. He said to the man, your mother did not have fleishiks on the Shabbos of the 9 days at Shalashudas because it was a minhag. It was because normally she would have leftovers on Sunday and Monday, and therefore was fine if food was left over from Shabbos. But on the Shabbos of the 9 days, you can't eat fleishiks the next few days. And therefore, she had to use it all up. She had it at Shalashudas not because it was a minhag, but because it was convenient.
Exactly. A very good example. It's a very good example where people see things happening and they're not sure where it comes from. Okay?
Rav Karlinsky, before we conclude, I want to ask you about another category of stringency that you mentioned to me before. Not only chumra da'ati de kula, a stringency that leads to a leniency, but a chumra da'ati de kilkul, stringency that leads to some sort of destruction. What does that mean exactly? Or a ruination?
The classic example is at the very, very beginning of creation. Chava was told, don't eat the Eitz Hadat. And she told the snake, I'm not allowed to touch the Eitz Hadat. And that was the beginning of the end. Because she made up something and said, I'm not allowed to do something when she was allowed to do it. And we have to keep that in mind and again, this goes back to the distortion of the Torah. We're not allowed to distort the Torah. The Torah is emes. And if it's mutter, you're not allowed to say it's usher. You want to say it's mutter, but I'm not going to do it for whatever reason. There is one other aspect we didn't talk about when we talk about chumrah, and that is when we're not sure about the mitzias. We're not sure about the reality. In other words, we talk about chumrah where there's a dispute among the halachic opinions, and there's more lenient opinions and more strict opinions. But there's also an idea that we're not sure what the reality is. So here we get to the idea that a suffix derabbanan, when you're not sure in a rabbinic law, you go leniently, and when you're not sure about a Torah law, you go more strictly. Okay, so here we get into the idea that sometimes people don't want to rely on a hechsher because this hechsher doesn't use 13 extra stringencies in the night. The halacha says what you have to do, but there people do more. So that's chumrah. But sometimes we're not sure what's going on. Right? We had an experience in the yeshiva where there was a hechsher, and we made some spot checks, and we found that they're not conforming to the policies. In other words, you have to know, is there a question about whether the guidelines are being followed, or is it just we're relying on more lenient opinions versus more strict opinions? And that's a big issue in kashrus.
So to conclude, Rav Karlinsky, there's been so much you've said today, which gives me, I'm sure everybody listening, a lot of food for thought, definitely thinking about things in a way which I have not in the past. When people want to have that stronger connection to the divine, they want to experience him through increased religiosity. Sometimes they can experience that by trying to do more. Is there a specific line you can generally draw for us of how to say, I want to do more, but I also don't want to fall into some of the mistakes we talked about today, whether it's the arrogance of Yuhara, whether it's chumrot da'ati de kula, chumrot da'ati de kilkul? Is there some general broad guideline you can offer us as a way to conclude?
Sure. Choose the things you want to be more meticulous about. Tzedakah, lashon hara, limud Torah, ben ano lechavero. If you're serious about upgrading your service of God, that's the place to start. It's very easy to start with kashrus. It's very easy to start with getting the most expensive tefillin because it has all 72 idurim. Okay, I'll say one of the things I see all the time, and it shows the inconsistency. Very Haredi people don't daven tefillah b'tzibur. They come late to minyan, and they miss tefillah b'tzibur. Wow, that's a place to be much more meticulous. And in monetary laws, I got to tell you the story because I see it, and it just in the swimming pool in the Blind Institute in Kiryat Moshe. It's a separate swimming, and most of the people there are all religious, ranging from just Bekoshi Shomer Shabbos all the way to super Haredim. And there's a big sign over the hair dryers. It's absolutely prohibited to use these hair dryers to dry shower shoes and bathing suits, only hair. It ruins the machine. That's what it says. More than once, I see guys, and they look very, very frum, drying their sandals there. Now, once I said something to somebody, and right away got upset, well, you're my mashgiach. But there's a halacha there. Kol ha'over al dat balabayit nikra gazlon. And somehow or other, they don't care. There were poskim who talk that these guys who drive wildly on the road, they have a din of rodef. Why aren't you careful about that? They're super careful about, heaven forbid, eating anything that's the highest level of hechsher. I got to say one more story about the hechsherim. Okay, again, where it's a chumrot because it's a real story. It happened years ago, and I just can't get it out of my mind. So we have a program, and we're in a hotel. It has a mahadran hechsher, but it's basic mahadran. It's not the highest level. So for the rabbinic staff, they ordered a higher level. That the meat that they serve on Shabbos should be at the higher level of kashrus. Oh, fine, very nice. It's before Shabbos, and the food is already coming out because it was a late Shabbos, it was a summer. And there's a couple of kids of one of the rabbis, and the kids are crying, they're hungry. Now, the rabbi was a Baal Tshuva, which I think is part of the explanation. And he doesn't let the kids eat because he says this isn't Hechsher X. That is a problem. That is chassid shota. There's no das there. Okay, you don't realize that what you're doing because of that chumra, that we're fine. We want to have an upgraded hechsher, but it's good for little kids, and it's the failure to have that balance of knowing where the basic halacha is, and you want to have an upgrade, but certainly when you want to be machmir, you machmir for yourself and not for your others. Again, one of the things is that, the husband doesn't carry in the Eruv, so the wife has to push the caravan and schlep the packages. That's, again, I'm not saying, again, it could be the wife wants it. I don't know what the answer is, but we have to realize that there's an issue, and we don't pay enough attention to the potential conflicts that arise when we go beyond the letter of the law. You know where Chazal say go beyond the letter of the law? Lifni mishur sadin. It's always in dinei mamanis. It's always in dinei mamanis. It's also always in ben adam lechavero. Somehow or other, that is missing. And if we want to really talk about upgrading our Judaism, upgrading our spirituality, that's for sure the place to start.
Amen. Wow, what an important idea. And Rav Karlinsky, as you know, I always enjoy talking with you. It's always so thought-provoking as well as entertaining. Today, I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone listening learned a lot as well. And I want to thank you for joining me.
It's okay. It's an honor. And good luck. Keep plugging away.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.